Good afternoon and welcome to the HDIAC webinar series. Today we have a webinar in our alternative energy focus area on advancements in solar photovoltaics given by our subject matter expert, Chris Strand. I'll turn it over there.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. As Melissa said, my name is Chris Doran. I support the HDIAC as a SME, a subject matter expert for alternative energy. And this is a good time to note that while I am a Northrop Grumman employee, the views or opinions presented in this webinar do not necessarily reflect those of Northrop Grumman Corporation. Now, with that said, let's talk a little bit about alternative energy in HDIAC. Here's a screenshot from the Homeland Defense Information Analysis Center website, HDIAC website. On the top, you'll see our set of 8 focus areas, which includes alternative energy on the right side there. When you start thinking about it, it doesn't take long to reason through why alternative energy falls under the purview of Homeland Defense. Energy supply, energy surety, they are critical components of our national security. The power of our domestic economy relies on available energy, as does the power of our warfighters abroad. The goal of alternative energy really is to grow and diversify our energy portfolio, and to do so in a way that minimally impacts the stability of our local and global environments. Alternative energy encompasses a huge array of technologies. I attempted a high-level brain dump onto this one slide to reflect the vastness of these technologies. Even this picture doesn't really capture the breadth and the diversity of the field. But it at least gets you thinking, gets you started. And as much as I'd love to delve into each and every one of these elements on here, the focus with you today is going to be on as an overview of solar photovoltaics down on the bottom. And my goal really is to provide a high-level understanding, a working knowledge, the foundation for you to go into a conversation and hear people talking about photovoltaics and really know what they're talking about, to be able to read those articles about the latest breaking records and have some context of what it means, and maybe even start placing your own bets on what's going to be the next breakthrough, the next record, which technology is going to win. So solar power. Now, if I sit back, put my philosopher's hat on, I could start talking about how the sun it's really the initial source of a lot of the extractable energy on Earth, pretty much everything except for nuclear. Think it through, the sun, it asymmetrically heats the Earth's surface, it causes weather. Weather makes wind, it makes waves, weather makes the storms that fill our dams with water. And the sun even helps the moon out with the tides for tide ocean energy conversion. And of course, hydrocarbons like oil derived from plants and algae that photosynthesize using the sun. And all of that is what makes PV, photovoltaics, so interesting. It's a direct conversion from the sun's light, or more broadly, it's electromagnetic radiation, to electricity. I think that there's been a lot of great marketing from the solar industry, so I think a lot of us understand the value of solar photovoltaics. It's renewable, it's flexible and scalable. It goes all the way from your school kid's calculator, powering the calculator, up to a soldier's backpack, all the way up to these solar farms where President Obama is standing in front that generate hundreds of megawatts of power. And solar is it's a well-understood technology. It's been around for a while. We have stable panels that last for 20 years or more, and it has low operational costs. Sunlight, it's free. You're not paying for oil, you're not paying for coal, you're not paying for any other sort of fuel. You're just getting free light coming out of the sky. And all of this is thanks to quantum physics. Yeah, you thought this was going to be an easy now. I'm going to delve into the quantum physics because I have to a little bit if you're going to understand photovoltaics. I promise I won't get too deep into the details. But it is because of the principles of quantum physics that we can have the photoelectric effect and have photovoltaics in general. Because of quantum physics, electrons exist in discrete energy states. And semiconductors have well-defined energy bands. And you can think of an energy band as a constant allowed energy level across the material where electrons can exist, period. They can't exist where there's no energy band. They can only exist where there's an energy band. And the corollary to a well-defined energy band is a well-defined band gap. So that picture on the right, if you look on the lower right, you'll see the two primary bands of a semiconductor, the conduction band at the top, valence band on the bottom, and between them is the band gap. So in a semiconductor, the relaxed electrons like to hang out on the valence band at the bottom. Drop for a moment. In a semiconductor, the electrons hang out in the valence band on the bottom. But if an incident light photon strikes the electron with sufficient energy, the electron can jump over the band gap and into the conduction band, and it leaves an empty hole in its place. Now that excited electron is not stable at the conduction band, so it will eventually fall back down to where it's comfortable at the bottom. But depending on the characteristics of the material, that electron can stay in the excited band for a while, long enough to extract it and do some work. For the example of silicon, that lifetime of an electron hanging out there is on the order of milliseconds, which is actually a long time from the perspective of electronics. By itself, the semiconductor, even with its bands, is not useful for PV until we dope it. And this concept of doping is to give a semiconductor a higher or lower electron population. It doesn't change the size of the band gap, but when you put a negative doped semiconductor into contact with a positive doped, and negative is denoted as N-type, positive is P-type on this diagram, it can make the higher or lower energy bands relative to each other. And this literally creates a diode. If you're familiar with electronics, you're familiar with a diode. A diode is a one-way street for current. A solar cell really is nothing but a highly specialized diode. Because when a photon excites an electron, that electron jumps the band gap, and then because of this asymmetric band structure, the electron flows downhill, and the hole, which you can visualize as a bubble, floats up to the right where it's more energetically favorable. And when enough photons keep striking the semiconductor, a current is created, which can be collected and moved through a circuit to do useful work. And there are a ton of semiconductors out there, but only a handful ever seem to come up in the context of photovoltaics. One reason for this is that different semiconductors have different band gaps. And for photovoltaics, this band gap matters a lot. Now, take a look at this graph I put up here, and there's an amazing amount of physics packed into this picture. What it shows is the amount of solar irradiance hitting the Earth as a function of wavelengths. And for the astrophysics folks out there, it roughly follows Planck's law, with some characteristic drops at various wavelengths due to absorption by things like water, CO2, oxygen, ozone in the air. And let's take a look at this graph for a minute and think about an example semiconductor, say silicon, which has a band gap right around the photon equivalent wavelength of the middle of this graph, the middle between left and right. Now, say a photon hits silicon with low energy on the right side of this graph. With that photon energy smaller than the band gap, it can't do a darn thing to move that electron across the band gap. So that photon goes through, it doesn't do anything. Now say a photon comes on the left side of the graph, the left side of the band gap, and has a super high energy. It's enough to make that electron jump the band gap, and we get to extract the energy from that photon. But any excess energy greater than the band gap is wasted. You only get as much energy as you get band gap. And so it's a fundamental trade-off central to PV design. Low band gap gets you large electron numbers, but a high band gap gets you higher voltage per electron, more bang for the buck, you could say. As I said, this trade-off is central, and it opposes some limitations to the max efficiency we can get out of classical PV cells. Now, I give you this background mainly to keep in the back of your mind for a bit, because I'm going to step through some different photovoltaic technologies, and this concept of this central trade-off is going to come up again a couple of times. So just keep it in mind. You can get a lot of low-energy photons, or you can get fewer high-energy photons with more voltage per photon. Central trade-off. Now let's jump into the designs. I'll start with the first generation. PV designs are often categorized by generation, and so I'll stick to that nomenclature for this to keep things consistent. First generation is known as the crystalline or polycrystalline PN junction. It's the most simple type of solar cell, and the type that's been around the longest. Silicon really dominates this market. It's well characterized. It's standing on the shoulders of the entire microchip industry, so there's a ton of understanding of silicon. And in addition to dominating this category, silicon dominates the market of photovoltaics as a whole. We're talking, I don't remember the number exactly, somewhere around 80-something% of the market is silicon. As a first-generation architecture, silicon isn't the ideal material. Gallium arsenide is often quoted as more ideal due to its particular properties, but it's more expensive to source and process, and so silicon is really what takes the cake here. So very mature. Second generation is synonymous with thin film. In contrast to the thick silicon cells I just talked about, on the order of 100 microns or so for a wafer, thin film has about 1 micron or so of highly light absorbent material. They're designed to cost, they're designed, manufactured typically using evaporation techniques onto, or sputtering techniques onto a material. And words like you hear about CadTel or SIGs or amorphous silicon, these are all thin film technologies. And often they can be flexible thin film technologies. Now, if you'll allow me to go on a historical note here, try not to digress too much, but thin film is an interesting story because by and large, it's a reaction to the spiky cost of silicon in the early and mid-2000s. Silicon cells need a ton of high purity material, and the processing to create these thick wafers is expensive. So a ton of R&D went into thin film in the mid to late 2000s to reduce the material volume. But then in the last 5 years or so, a massive amount of silicon processing capacity just surged and came online, mostly out in China, which completely glutted the market, brought down cost of first-generation silicon, which is fantastic for expanding the photovoltaic penetration. But it really created a competitive market challenge for thin film, and it lost some market share, though, around then. Went from a peak of around 18% or something like that. Now it's down to around 10%. But it's still going strong, and we still do see a lot of CadTel and SIGs especially coming online. So we went through first generation, second generation. Third generation is where it gets fun. Third generation, I categorize as the exotics. Everything that's not first and not second falls into the category of third gen. And these designs diverge drastically. We have organics, we have multi-junction, we have dye-synthetized. Now, none of these third-gen technologies have any real market share. They're largely low technology readiness level. They're largely in the labs. But this is the fun stuff. If you go to a conference on solar, you'll see that most papers presented are on third-gen technologies. Most of the scientists are talking about the newest stuff in third-gen, because this is where the discovery really is. So as I said, organic, multi-junction, dye-synthetized are the big subcategories from my perspective, and I'll step through these different types. Starting with organics, largely similar concept as we've talked about so far, the PN junction concept, the excite the electron, extract it out the other side. The difference is that we're using organic semiconductors to do the job instead of the inorganics, like silicon, like CadTel, like SIGs. When you read about organics, I think the easiest way to think about it is, as I said, similar concepts as inorganics, but do a little bit of active translation in your brain while you're reading. It uses a slightly different lexicon. It switches from valence band, conduction band to HOMO-LUMO band. HOMO is highest occupied molecular orbital, LUMO is lowest unoccupied molecular orbital. And N-type, P-type lexicon switches to donor-acceptor. Once you make those little switches, just do a find and replace in your brain, and you'll start to understand organics a little bit better. There are some very cool potential advantages with organics. As I said, I still call it an emerging technology, but there's a possibility of drastically lowering the cost of production, making large area manufacturing and making flexible devices that are on plastics instead of brittle materials. And you don't have to do all of this in a clean room necessarily, which brings down the cost a lot. But so far the progress has been lagging behind the inorganic cells. The efficiencies are still low, and stability is still a real concern. When you have sunlight hitting organic molecules, just as you leave a plastic chair outside in the hot summer sun, the chair plastic breaks down. You see the same sort of things happening with organic cells. And obviously you want to keep your solar cell in the sun. But we have some hope. The organic LED market, OLED, has been driving incredible advancements in organic LEDs, which are very similar to photovoltaic. You can think of an LED as a backwards photovoltaic cell. And there's a lot of lessons learned, a lot of tradecraft that's been figured out in the OLED market for TVs and monitors and this and that, which can be applied to the photovoltaic technology. And after all, plants are organic photovoltaics if you sort of think about it, and plants do pretty darn well in creating energy, usable energy from the sun. So there's a lot of room for breakthrough in the organic domain. More mature, but still very much at the cutting edge, are multi-junction, also known as tandem solar cells. Recall back to our discussion a few minutes ago on the trade-off of band gaps, where I said you can optimize for more photons or you can optimize for more energetic photons. Multi-junction cells aim to do all of the above all at once, getting the best of all worlds. What they do is they stack a high band gap junction to get the high energy cells on top of a low band gap junction to pick up I said high energy cells and high energy photons on top of a low band gap junction to capture the leftover photons, the lower energy ones. And the end result is that you can get efficiencies that currently in the lab go up to 46%, double that of the best silicon. And the theoretical efficiency limit of these sort of cells goes up to over 80%, which is mind-boggling. As you might imagine, there are a lot of delicate design optimizations and fabrication processes involved with these devices. I don't want to dive too deep into it, but they do contribute to higher costs, to be sure. To my knowledge, deployment has largely been focused on space-based applications because they're willing to pay a cost premium for performance when an ounce of payload is literally worth its weight in gold. But another potential application is in what's called concentrating solar, where you can have a expensive but small and highly efficient cell that can be small and then have a bunch of optics over a large surface area that can collect a lot of sun and focus it onto this tiny cell. So even though it's expensive per cell, you can still potentially get some multiplicative effects, capturing a lot of area using very cheap optics. So multi-junction cells, complex, but very powerful potential. Third generation, dye-sensitized, represents the third subcategory of third gen. You might have heard of these as referred to as Gratzel cells, after the Swiss chemist who came up with the design, Michael Gratzel. These are a very different architecture from what we've discussed so far. Dye sensitized relies on a redox reaction, much like a conventional electrochemical battery, which is very different from the diodes we've seen so far. And maybe the best way to understand this is if you take a look at that image, and I'll walk through it. Those little red circles, those are the dye molecules, and those are central to a dye sensitized cell, as you might imagine from the name. These dyes are often ruthenium-based, and these photosensitive ruthenium-based molecules absorb light and generate electron hole couples, which in the parlance of dye sensitized are called excitons, loosely bound electron hole pairs. The electrons from these couples are injected into the titanium dioxide, which is very high surface area to be close to the photosensitive dye. And then the dye itself, which now has a positive charge because it lost its electron, is regenerated by this redox mediator, which in the case of this picture could be a liquid, actually. Example of that would be an iodine, triiodine mediator. And then the current would flow between the anode and the cathode, set up your circuit just like you would with a battery or a solar cell, a first or second generation. Some really cool potential advantages in this. The absorption of these cells are completely engineerable. It's all about the dye, as I said. So if you come up with a different dye structure, you can completely engineer, match your cell to the particular solar characteristics of the area that you're trying to absorb sun from. And it has the potential of low cost. Just like with the organics that I talked about, you don't necessarily need a clean room to do this. You don't necessarily need super high processing capabilities. And in fact, you can actually, I've heard of someone doing this recently, you can go online and buy a dye-sensitized solar cell kit and make your own dye-sensitized cell. They give you the basic materials, you can put it together in your little packet, put it out in the sun, and get your power out of it. And then another potential advantage on the marketing side, it kind of goes hand in hand with the tunable absorption thing, is that you can literally make rainbow cells. They have cells that are all sorts of different colors, and so you can put it on backpacks, and they'll be flexible, and they'll have different colors, and you can match the backpack itself. Really, it's a statement to how you can tune it to the sun. There's been some challenges, though, for sure, and that's the reason you don't see it high penetration. Lifetime is the biggest one. They tend to break down, especially when they have liquids in there. Hermetic sealing is still something that needs to be worked out completely. Inefficiencies, especially, have not been reaching the traditional first and second gen style cells. But I've seen market predictions saying that the dye-sensitized market will continue to slowly grow, and they're projecting 130 million or so over the next 8 years. So there's definitely a lot of reason to continue investment. Now, if you really want to get into the bleeding edge, we've been talking about the cutting edge. You want to get into the bleeding edge, you're going to start talking about quantum dots. Quantum dot is not a solar cell in itself, but it's an exciting component to a solar cell. Quantum dot, I'm a nano guy, so I love this sort of stuff. A quantum dot is a nanoparticle containing a countable number of atoms. And quantum dots have been called artificial atoms because they confine electrons in 3 dimensions, and they can cause the electrons to occupy discrete energy levels just within the dot itself, much like you see the bands across a bulk semiconductor. And this has a lot of implications. The first one is the tunable band gap. You can precisely tune your band gap to specific parts of the solar spectrum just by adjusting the radius of these dots. And you can see this in the picture on the lower right. There's 5 little vials, and each of those contain quantum dots, so the only difference is the diameter of the dot. And you can see that they're different colors. And the color that the dot emits is a proxy for the color that the dot absorbs, and the band gap is the material. So if you look at that green vial, for example, you can see that these quantum dots are targeting right around the 530 nanometer wavelength range. And just like with the dye-sensitized cells with the engineerable dyes, you can engineer the quantum dots to target specific parts of the solar spectrum and really optimize your cell design. So first implication, precisely tunable bandgap. Second cool thing about quantum dots, which is bleeding edge, is this concept of multiple exciton generation. Or in layman's terms, I like to call it double the bandgap, double the electron. This is the way around that trade-off that I was talking about earlier. As I discussed before, if a photon strikes a bulk semiconductor with double bandgap energy, all of that excess would be lost. But with the confinement of quantum dots, you can precisely engineer that band structure and engineer it in such a way that one high-energy photon could create multiple electron-hole pairs, or a little differently, multiple low-energy photons could create one higher-energy carrier. This is really cool. It's low technology readiness level, low TRL for sure, but absolutely fascinating science. And this could be used in a lot of different ways for solar cells. You can augment the traditional cells or the organic cells to tune your absorption. You could replace the dye, the ruthenium-based dye in the dye-sensitized cells. And that's the most common approach with labs today. Or there are any number of hybrid architectures that do both of those in some degree or another. And there's some really interesting possibilities that have been coming out. One is the idea of spray-on solar. This is the concept of, instead of painting your house with boring old paint, you paint your house, you spray your house with quantum dot-based solutions, put on a couple different layers that are precise layers, and you end up with walls and paint that is generating electricity for you. That's a really cool idea. Hasn't gotten any sort of at-scale demonstration yet, but it's a cool thing to think about. And maybe in 10 years or so, we'll start seeing that for real. Now, I got one more design to talk about, and as I said, when I was thinking I have to choose one more material to discuss, I'd be yelled at to not let it be perovskites. That's because this is generally hailed as the next big thing. It has a lot of scientists excited, nerding out about perovskites. Now, to be clear, a perovskite is a material. It is not a solar cell in and of itself. It's a material just like you would call silicon or gallium arsenide or any of those material. And furthermore, this material is nothing new to us. Named after a Russian mineralogist from the early 1800s who discovered it back in the 1800s. But what is new is the application of perovskites to photovoltaics. The typical investigated material is an organometal trihalide, but there are other halides investigated as well. And since their investigation, or their discovery in a solar cell in 2009 in Japan by Miyasaka, recorded efficiencies have massively improved. The original discovery, they published 3.8%. 6 years later, we hit 20%. This rate of discovery is unprecedented. And if nothing else, it demonstrates, even if perovskites don't take over the world, it at least demonstrates the accelerated pace of discovery that we as a species have achieved in the field of photovoltaics. Really cool. You can kind of think of it as, if nothing else, if there's another material that's discovered in 5 years from now, we'll be able to capitalize on that very quickly and not have these long development cycles that we've seen as we're learning the lessons from silicon and such. What we can thank for that with photovoltaics is a couple of different properties of perovskites. The first one that makes perovskites work really well is ultra-fast electron and hole injection rates. So if you use it in a dye-sensitized cell, for example, you can inject the electrons from the perovskite into the into the titanium dioxide and the conductor really quickly. And secondly is the carrier diffusion length, meaning the length that an electron can meander through the material before getting thermalizing back to its ground state. This diffusion length is 100 times higher than other photovoltaic materials that we've looked at before. And furthermore, it's a value that's about 10 times the absorption depth, meaning that you can very easily extract the excited electrons once a photon hits the material. This is cool stuff. There's some possibilities of manufacturing that are a little different too. You can solution process perovskites. People have showed spray-on, roll-to-roll printing, spin coating, a lot of different low-cost approaches. But there are still some challenges to overcome for sure. Stability is the biggest one, especially near oxygen, water. We've seen perovskites start to lose efficiency after a while, after testing. Some light-soaking, hysteretic behavior. That may be overcome, we'll see. Certainly better hermetic seals will help with that. And then the most common perovskite materials studied today have lead in them, which would be nice to remove. If we're going to be using solar to save the environment, it would be nice to avoid environmental bad things like lead in there. And there are some alternative materials that use tin, for example, instead of lead in the structure, which we'll see going on. So with these, we have these different designs. I've gone through it. I tried to give a little bit of background on the designs, and I think this is the point where we can finally start to understand the almighty efficiency graph. There is a wealth of info in this chart. This is from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab. And this chart, getting your solar cell on this chart is something of a badge of honor for a solar cell researcher. You can see all of the names on here in gray. To get your name on this is a big deal because it means you've broken a record. And there's a lot of info in here. And you know, I had two thoughts when I was putting this presentation together. One is that I could do a one-slide presentation just based on this graph, because I could talk about this forever, and we can talk about all of the things that we already discussed in this slide. The second thought I had was I should maybe skip the slide completely because it's just too detailed. Although in the end you can see I included it to show breadth and sort of a wrap-up of all of the technology we talked about. If you're excited at all about the topic of photovoltaics, I really encourage you, go to NREL's website, download it, and gaze at it for a while. And then download it again a few months later. They do keep it up to date. And gaze at it again. You'll note a lot of subtleties in here. I mean, we talked about the high efficiency of multi-junction cells. You can see those trending at the top, culminating at 46% in purple. You'll see the slow and steady rise of the blue square silicon going through the years, staying asymptotically approaching the theoretical limits of silicon. And you can see that little rocket of progress on the lower right, those yellow circles with red rings around them. Those are the perovskites. And look at how the speed of discovery on those is double, triple what the speed of discovery is on some other materials. Wealth of info, very cool plot. Really encourage you to spend some time checking it out if you're interested in this stuff. Now, before wrapping up completely, I do want to take a moment to address the economic side of solar. We talked about the technology so far, but the success of solar photovoltaics ultimately is defined, not even affected, but I would say defined by its economics. Because if we want the advantages of solar, we have to displace the current competition to solar, which is conventional electric generation. The cool thing in this chart is that you'll see that there is a general downward trend. Solar PV has been getting cheaper each year, with a small exception of a bump in late 2000s, which if you think back a few slides ago when I talked about the silicon market swings, where there was a shortage of silicon, thin film research ramped up, and then silicon got cheap again, that completely correlates to the rise and then dramatic fall in price from around 2005 through the 2012 timeframe. And if you dive even deeper into this graph as the whole price, if you dive a little deeper, we can start breaking down what those costs are. This chart shows, over time there's these downward trends of the total cost, and this shows what contributes to the cost. You'll see on the bottom, the blue is the module, that's the solar cell itself, but then there's all this yellow. There's the BOS, the balance of systems, and it's a big part of the cost. It's kind of like how it takes that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a balance of systems to raise a solar panel, to run a solar panel. So while we up to focus on the tech of the PV themselves, we do need to remember that it's not the whole story, and there's a lot of work to be done still with this balance of systems. Installation labor is a big part of it. Permitting, really big part of it. Mechanical support structures, power electronics, wiring, power point tracking for efficiency, power conversion, power buffering, self-protection, all those things fall into the category of balance of systems. And once we're looking at this last part, we'll see that Q4 2013 on the right, it actually outweighs the module cost. Interesting. But even if we aren't able to decrease balance of system costs, we can at least use this to help explain why when I do consider the PV cell side of the cost equation, I have put so much emphasis on efficiency. That last chart, the NREL chart, was all about efficiency. And that's because you get more bang for the cell. And if you have more power extracted per cell, then that means less balance of systems needed in total, and a lower cost per watt ultimately. So balance of system matters, cell efficiency matters. It all plays into the cost. And the cost is why solar can be successful or not. This presentation, to wrap it up, it really only touched the surface of the technology area. In some ways, it's hard to write a single conclusion page because my goal from the start was to generally provide a tech primer on a very broad field. But there are some points to be sure that I hope you'll walk away with. One is that the diversity of technology in solar is vast. I went over the broad categories. If you dive into each category, there's so many different approaches, so many cool things that labs are doing right now. And there's plenty of discoveries left to be made with the technology. Look at Profskite. The next material that's discovered is going to progress even faster than that, I bet. Number two, performance per cost is only expected to get better with time. We're already seeing solar get to the point of what's called grid parity, meaning it's reaching the cost of the alternative generation, what you're getting from the grid in some states, and it's growing state by state, country by country each year. It's a great story, and it's continuing to get greater even as the incentives are being backed off on the government side. And then, as I just said with the economic slides, there's, in addition to all of the technology that I just mentioned, there's more to advancing solar than advancing just the technology itself. We do have to consider the balance of systems and think creatively on the ways that we can restructure everything outside of the cell, even if it's the stuff like permitting, to reduce the cost and make it more attractive. And we're seeing great advancements in that even still. And that'll hit a limit probably before the cells hit a limit, but it's still a big part of the cost equation, often outweighing the cells itself. So a deep thank you to everyone who is listening. My hope is that you can walk away with a little bit more informed and hopefully a lot more excited about solar photovoltaics. If you have any questions, I encourage you to get in touch with me. My info is on there. You can send me an email. Or if you have questions related to HDIAC in general, Stuart is our esteemed director. His contact info is there, and we'd both love to hear from you. So thank you again, and I'll hand it back to Melissa.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you all for attending the HDIAC webinar. Have a good afternoon.